Hello and welcome to another episode of Wrestling with Memories. I'm joined by Fash, the $1 Million Fan, and I'm Wax, the Brain Hussein. And get ready for another episode where we run through the glory days of the WWF, WWE, and wrestling in general in 1991. Fash, how are you doing?
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, the World Podcasting Federation proudly brings to you its tag team champions of the world. He is Wax, I am Fash. We are Wrestling with Memories. And if you're not down with that, I've got two words for you. Please subscribe. I'm Will Wax. How are things your end?
Very good, thank you. Very good. Just excited to be talking about wrestling again.
Well, I thought you'd be excited a little bit more because a little birdie tells you my sources tell me that it's your birthday today. And you're another year wiser. The brain's another year older.
Yeah, the brain always gets wiser and wiser every day, and age is just a number, as they say. But yeah, it is my birthday, but I would rather be talking wrestling than doing anything else.
I'm sure you would, but only thing I wanted to say was it might be your birthday, but that doesn't mean that I'm gonna give you a title shot. I'm still the champion of the world. I'm gonna remain the champion of the world. So you can enjoy your cake today. You can have a good time, but at the end of the day, you're never going to get that birthday present that you really want, Wax, which is the World Championship, the championship which I have and will always have. But with that out of the way, I'm feeling good today. I'm feeling good. I'm glad it's your birthday. I'm glad you're fit and healthy. And what's your thoughts been just on our first three shows and the kind of feedback we've been getting?
I mean, it's certainly been it's been a great time just chatting about wrestling like we've always done over the years. But going back and reliving some of those moments for probably the first time in a long time, it's certainly been very fun for me. And just actually going back and thinking about how interesting wrestling was back then, and some of the big characters that deserve another look from our viewership at this point. Now that we're much older. So certainly I've enjoyed it. What sort of feedback have you been getting, Fash?
It's been good so far. I mean, I just want to thank everyone that's been supporting us in these early days. It's great because that motivation really helps. And people giving us feedback and good ideas. So various people actually, people that we knew from the past, some new people as well, just giving their comments, ideas, really liking what we're doing. We have some podcast listeners who are doing the easy listening. We've got people who are watching on YouTube. So no, really value the support. And I think in coming weeks we'll be giving shout outs to the people that have been supporting us the most. And look, it's really great, and it's the kind of energy we're looking for, and hopefully we can continue to entertain everyone and just take everyone back, which is the purpose of this podcast. I think when we started it with lockdown and various other things going on, we thought it was a nice time to kind of kick off and take everyone back into the golden era and all walk to where we are today together. So the feedback's been great from my end. Really appreciate the Instagram followers, really appreciate everyone on Facebook, and as I said, through other means as well. It's been great.
Right, Fash, let's kick off with our show today. What are we going to cover?
Well, before I do that, I thought to mention one thing in terms of Instagram. Now, you, in our last episode, I talked about the Nasty Boys and how great they were. Well, you may have seen the results of our latest Instagram poll. And actually, as I knew, the majority did not agree with you. I think most agree with me that though we respect everyone from the past, the Nasty Boys did suck relative to other teams. So I just wanted to kind of thank everyone that voted. And, it's good to know that society hasn't let me down.
I think that's just people have older, they've forgotten the good old days, and they're all whinging little so-and-sos.
Well, as Grandma Monsoon would say, will you stop? Now moving
yes,
on to...
I will. So let's move on, Fash.
Yeah. So I think where we left things off was WrestleMania 7. And at that point, I think we both agreed that maybe it wasn't the strongest 3 months for the WWF in 1991. We were still to come to the point we were watching it, but we're in that phase now. But for me, post WrestleMania, 1991 becomes a lot of fun. And I think that helped with us in our fandom and just, people around us getting really excited about it. So there was some really interesting storylines, some really interesting characters, a number of new people showing up. And what you found was it was the best of wrestling cheese and what you'd call WrestleCrap, as well as just the greatness of wrestling and why we love it. So all the kind of things that we love are kind of visible in the months post WrestleMania. I mean, there was various debuts. There was departures. I think we're going to speak about two of the big debuts, but we'll get to that, and just interesting storylines. But I don't know. I mean, when I'm thinking about this year, and I was reminiscing about how I was feeling at the time and what I think right now, but I can say that I think the MVPs of 1991 after WrestleMania were Jake the Snake Roberts and The Undertaker. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
I think you've picked out two great names. Undertaker had an incredible debut year with the WWF, and he was involved in so much good stuff. He was built up to be this, this monster, and he proved, in everything that he did, that he really was. And then in Jake the Snake Roberts, we've got one of the all-time greats, and not just in the ring, but his psychology outside of the ring, just
Absolutely.
everything, the way he delivered his promos, the way he talked, his facial expressions, he was top notch.
Yeah, one of the best speakers ever, one of the best heels, and this is where, you know, I think it's his best phase. He's going to enter as the ultimate bad guy, and you appreciate it so much. I think at the time when they say Undertaker just creep people out, right, and Jake the Snake Roberts, what he's going to become, scared a lot of people as well. But for me, we're the MVPs, and we were on the road to SummerSlam post WrestleMania because we're still in the four big event phase. But I guess starting off with Jake, he was part of one of the first kind of storylines coming out of WrestleMania. So he'd had his blindfold match with Rick Martel, which you spoke about in the last episode. He actually gets involved in a feud with the Earthquake. So he's still a babyface. And we're going to get you to explain these wrestling terms in one of our special little bonus episodes, but he's still a babyface, i.e., a good guy leading out of WrestleMania. And he has an altercation with Earthquake, which leads to a match on Superstars of Wrestling. And one of the most shocking things happens as little kids watching this. Earthquake is going to squash the Undertaker's snake, Damien, and kill the snake. Now, this was quite harrowing for all children watching this back in the day. And so one of the shocking scenes, actually, when you watch it on YouTube, even now, it's as entertaining as you'd think. But I want to point out that wasn't really a snake. We learned years later that it was pantyhose with sausages stuffed in. So I can say there was no animals were hurt during that episode. But this was the big kind of thing. Damien was brought in as the key ally of Jake the Snake Roberts, the snake. So this was a big deal from a storyline perspective, and I say some of wrestling at its cheesiest best. But quite unusual feud when you think about it. Earthquake, a big guy, just off his feud with Hulk Hogan, Jake Roberts, one of the most dangerous good guys, but it just felt like it would be a style mishmash. Interestingly, we're in a period of wrestling where everything wasn't settled on pay-per-view. So we didn't get a pay-per-view match between these two, but what we did get was various storylines on television, and their actual matches were on the house show circuit, so i.e. the live events that fans would go to. Now following the squashing of Damien, Earthquake appeared on Primetime Wrestling with Vince McMahon, Lord Alfred Hayes, and Bobby the Brain Heenan, and he served something known as Quake Burgers to to the hosts. Eventually, as you can imagine, we learn that the Quake Burgers are actually Damien Burgers, and they've been eating Jake the Snake Roberts' pet. This ultimately led to a series of matches, which came to an end, I think, the start of July. Madison Square Garden. It was Earthquake versus Jake the Snake Roberts, with Andre the Giant in Jake Roberts' corner. And the match ended with, you'll be surprised, a clean pin victory. Jake Roberts DDT'd Earthquake after distraction from Andre. And that actually ended the feud there. As I say, we didn't get a pay-per-view match. What I understand was supposed to happen at the time was they were trying to see if Andre could make a comeback. So leading up to this, those various storylines were interjecting here, or intersecting, I should say, with various managers were coming up to Andre and offering the services for him to return. He went through each of them, rejecting them. The last one was Jimmy Hart. He announces to the world that Earthquake and Andre the Giant are going to be his new tag team. Andre rejects this, gets attacked by Earthquake. And unfortunately, the reason behind this was Andre's mobility and health in general was pretty bad at this stage. He needed crutches, and this explained why. So essentially, he was in Jake's corner, and I understand what was supposed to happen was a tag team confrontation, because also leading into SummerSlam, our man Tugboat, who you're a big fan of, was in a 6-man tag encounter. It was Tugboat and the Bushwhackers versus the Nasty Boys and Earthquake. But the man known as Tugboat turned on the Bushwhackers, aligned himself with Jimmy Hart and his cronies, and a new tag team was born: the Natural Disasters, Typhoon, and Earthquake. And the original plan was supposed to be Jake Roberts and Andre taking on the Natural Disasters at SummerSlam. Well, because of Andre's health, that couldn't happen. So this event was kind of, this altercation didn't take place. The feud between Earthquake and Jake Roberts was ended on a special, and then we'd move into the next phase, which would be the more interesting phase for Jake Roberts, as he'd get involved with another storyline. So I don't know. I mean, as I say, at this time, did you watch any of this live, or was it once again after the
It's
fact?
amazing. We always seem to remember the key moments having watched them. So, Earthquake squashing uh, Damien allegedly in the ring. So that certainly is bright in my memory. But I don't really recall much else about that feud. But yeah, you're right in that Andre obviously was very hampered by that point. And no surprise it didn't want to work with Earthquake, because he doesn't like working with other big men. From what we know about Andre the Giant, he's never a fan of all these other big wrestlers. And the interesting thing is, I mean, a snake is generally a heel animal if you think about it. So I've never really seen or heard of such sympathy for a snake as there was at that point in Jake the Snake's career. But again, only Jake really could have got that much out of Earthquake in that angle. And his work in the ring and just outside, it convinces you that there was a bit of emotion involved around the snake.
And at this point, he'd brought in another snake as part of that feud, so a much bigger snake, which was known as Lucifer, which was used in these matches. And I think this was a prelude to what was going to happen, because as you've signposted it pretty well, Jake Roberts, when you look at the character, he wasn't your classic good guy or babyface. He was kind of the anti-hero, similar to Roddy Piper, an anti-hero who people were cheering, but only because he was presented as a good guy. But when you look at the character, the way he, approached everything, it was actually a great bad guy there. And actually, when he entered the WWF in 1986-87, he started off as a bad guy, but then he turned babyface, and this was, quite a long stretch. But as you see, the character and the presentation was more suited to a heel.
I mean, certainly he reminds me a lot, or he's got a lot of similarities to the Stone Cold character who came later, obviously the Rattlesnake, and a guy that was really should have been a heel if it had been 10 years earlier. And Jake's had very
the kind of loner character, dangerous, cerebral. The anti-people like to cheer, and even going back when Hulk Hogan was supposed to have this feud with Jake the Snake Roberts in '87. They did a segment where Jake Roberts DDTs Hulk Hogan. It wasn't shot for TV. It would have been if it went ahead, but the crowd was chanting DDT. And as soon as that happened, Vince McMahon kiboshed it, saying there's no way he's going to have, anyone get a certain cheer over Hulk Hogan, which from a business perspective, you can understand. So, he was one of those characters ahead of his time. And as you say, great talker. And we were going to see the best of him.
Trust me, trust me, trust me, trust me.
The other storyline I'm going to move to now, post WrestleMania, was a really big one. It was the Ultimate Warrior and the Undertaker. And this, once again, was going to be wrestling at its best storyline-wise in this period. As we know, WrestleMania 7, you reviewed it. The Ultimate Warrior defeated the Macho Man in a retirement match. He's no longer the champion, so what does he do next? Well, he appears on The Funeral Parlor, which was a show that Paul Bearer used to present back in the day. It was a replacement for the Brother Love show. The Warrior appears on it. They have a back and forth. The Undertaker then appears from one of the coffins that are standing there in the background, and he locks the Ultimate Warrior in the coffin for several minutes. Now, we're talking about the snake being squashed, right? But a man actually being locked in that airtight coffin. This was once again pushing at the boundaries of what was largely, a family-friendly audience. And what I remember here was, and I rewatched it the other day. There's several minutes, people are rushing around trying to open this coffin, and the most interesting element was Macho Man on commentary, because post WrestleMania, the Macho Man was now a commentator alongside Roddy Piper and Vince McMahon on Superstars. So initially, he's kind of happy about what's happened because they're still playing off the fact that he's got resentment. This is the man that ended his career. But as the segment goes on, the Macho Man's showing more and more concern, which is moving him towards what's eventually going to be his babyface turn. So he's like, there's panic, open this coffin up. Eventually, they get it open, and the Undertaker's the Ultimate Warrior just lying there still. And this was quite a harrowing image and a different type of feud that you hadn't seen, really taking things to the dark side. Once again, it's a feud that this is what we saw on television. What was happening on non-TV events was a series of matches between the Undertaker and the Ultimate Warrior, which people can actually find online, I'm sure. But it was a series of body bag matches and a casket match as well. Have you seen any of these?
No, but I recall Undertaker, and early on he used to come out with a body bag, and once he'd defeat his opponent, he would put them in the body bag, and that would be the end of them. So an interesting concept. I certainly think the casket match was the next level to a body bag. The body,
yeah.
Quite great on TV, did it?
Yeah, it was a thing. It didn't have the. I mean, it was. I think it probably still gave the heebie-jeebies to a lot of kids watching it. But you're right. I mean, what they evolved into initially, the coffin match and then the casket match was bigger. But one of my memories from this is, and it was the Ultimate Warrior won every single one of these matches, interestingly, and typically it would end with him grabbing the urn, hitting the Undertaker, either zipping him up or putting him in the casket. But they still kept Undertaker really strong, and this is something that maybe doesn't happen as much now with heels. So in one of these matches that I saw, he zips him up, match ends, Warrior wins the match, leaves the ring, and the Undertaker sits up while he's still zipped up in the bag. It's one of the most badass images you can think of. Similarly with the casket, he just kind of gets up. But that was happening there. But this is where the intersection's going to come back. So I don't know if you've got any.
Yeah, so let's just run back to the parlor a second. There was a few things that I noticed. Obviously, first when all these officials start coming out and they're really selling this airtight container. And the number of tools that they bring out with them is very impressive.
It's hilarious.
So, I mean, it starts off with a crowbar, move on to a hammer and a chisel. I'm not sure what they intend to achieve. Then somebody has a drill, and quite quickly you hear somebody in the background shouting, "Bring an extension for the drill." So it was just pure comedy at that point. And then a sledgehammer. So they're actually sledgehammering the top of the coffin while the Undertaker is lying within it.
Exactly.
Which you think is a little bit dangerous. And then they eventually do get the sledgehammer open, and Warrior is knocked out, and they have to. I don't know who it was that was giving him mouth to mouth.
It was. I'm trying to remember if
I can't remember whether it was Earl or it was somebody else, but I certainly remember that quite vividly, and eventually Warrior is woken up from it, and it's not a Warrior that we've seen very often, somebody who's down and out,
vulnerable.
Vulnerable. A Warrior was the ultimate babyface. He was always getting one up on everybody in every segment that he did, pretty much. This was the first time we'd really seen him in a lot of trouble. But it was really entertaining. It was a great skit, and you had the commentary from Macho Man.
Vince McMahon was amazing. It's typical. Yeah. We didn't realize here that Vince McMahon's the owner of the whole thing, right?
Yeah,
I think most fans didn't realize for a number of years. And his over-the-top commentary of the funny thing is they're shouting at everyone else, but three of them didn't bother getting up and actually.
And they're right next to where it's happening.
Exactly.
But yeah, it was a tremendous segment, and you're right. It's everything that's great about wrestling angles. It is a bit hokey, but it's entertaining, and it's brilliant.
I'd like to say it's something that was different at the time. Now, recently we've heard likes of Bruce Pritchard say that they kept Warrior in the coffin for a bit longer, but just to teach him a lesson, all the guys that didn't like him, which is a typical swipe at the Warrior. And they'd actually tried out the casket on Road Warrior Hawk. They needed somebody of similar size. Warrior wasn't available, so they basically were tailor-made Hawk, who was a similar stature to the Warrior. They tested it on him. But we're into this really dark storyline now, and this is where Jake the Snake Roberts is going to get involved as well. So he's done his earthquake thing. He's now a guest on the Funeral Parlor, And he says to Paul Bearer that, if the Ultimate Warrior lets him, he will teach him about the dark side, and equip him to be able to face the Undertaker. And Paul Bearer's quite scared about this, which then leads to this alliance between the Ultimate Warrior and Jake the Snake Roberts, and the 3 tests. So I can talk about these tests if you like, and how a great storyline it would have been. I think watching at that point, I think most people didn't get where this was going. The old school fans of the time would have seen what was going on, and leading up to this, Jake was acting a little bit different from what he was, say, 4 or 5 months before this. But ultimately, the first thing he does is Jake puts the Ultimate Warrior in a coffin so he can get past that fear. So these are, let's say, wrestling cheese at its best. You need to go and find these segments because the music, the way they're shot, the way they're acting, it's just all brilliant. It is, wrestle crap at its best, but wrestle greatness as well, I'd call it. And Jake is brilliant through this, and the Warrior's playing his part perfectly as well. But they pass the first one, which is, locking him up in a coffin. He survives it. The second one is Jake tells Warrior that he's going to bury him alive, and he does that, and he places a skull to look him straight in the eye. And what I remember about this is, and it's hilarious, is Warrior shouting, "Bury me, Snake Man, bury me," which he does, and he passes that test. And then we're on to the third one, and this is where the twist in the tale is going to be. They're outside this room. Jake Roberts tells the Ultimate Warrior to go into the room, show no fear. Warrior has this trust with him. He said, I've trusted you so far, I will continue to. Walks in his room, there's no lights there. Jake Robertson flicks the lights open, and there's a whole bunch of snakes all over the floor, right? And Warrior starts kicking these snakes left, right, and center, which we learned years later. Jake Roberts wasn't happy about that. Wasn't supposed to happen. But he's showing probably the genuine fear because these snakes were definitely not fake. There's a box there. Jake tells him to open the box, and this will complete the teachings. So he slowly opens it. There's a big cobra there, and the cobra strikes the Ultimate Warrior. And at that point, for the audience, the penny drops. Jake Roberts is in on this whole thing. He opens the door. Warrior's on the ground. Jake's taunting him, and then you see him at the feet of somebody. The Undertaker's music plays, the camera looks up, and the Undertaker standing there with Paul Bearer. And leading into this, Jake the Snake Roberts was saying, to trust him, and he ends it with, "Never trust a snake." And it is just a brilliant heel turn in terms of how they did this, and the fact that actually makes sense as well. The alliance of an Undertaker with the Jake Roberts, the dark side. It was just brilliantly done when you look back at it. I say super cheesy, but a really good way of shifting different characters and way better storytelling than what we were seeing at the start of the year.
Yeah, and I think Jake, obviously, as you mentioned, he was the star of this show. Everything he did, from his acting, the way he would talk to the Warrior, trying to convince him to do things, was tremendous. And Warrior, even though he was doing this weird rumbling noise all the time, he did play his part. He hammed it up really well. It was a tremendous angle. All 3 skits that they did, they worked them really, really well. I was thinking when Warrior was kicking away those snakes, the real WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, wouldn't be happy about that.
Well, that's the thing. I mean,
and there was actually a moment in when Jake, I think, says, on screen, "Careful, you don't have to hurt the snakes," or something along those lines.
You're right. Actually, he does. He does say that.
There is a line in there, and I thought that was very real. It probably was a very real.
At which
moment.
point, Warrior kicks them even harder.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. If I was in the same situation as the Warrior, I'd be stomping on them. He'd be terrified. But it was a great setup. It's just a shame they didn't show, obviously, anything beyond him, the Undertaker coming in.
Well, I think what it is now, then, this is going to lead to SummerSlam, which we're going to discuss, even though there's not a match between these entities. But the whole idea is, Warrior's been struck by a cobra. Can he make it to SummerSlam? But the biggest shame is that we actually didn't get a continuation of this, because as we're going to discuss, the Warrior's not going to be here for long. But I mean, just thinking about it, a series between Jake Roberts and the Warrior could have been really good. I mean, we're not saying from an in-ring perspective, though it would have been interesting to see what that dynamic would have been and if Jake could have done something. But just from a storyline perspective, where they started it and where they could have took it, it's still intriguing to this day. And they just kept missing each other after this. Warrior's going to go away, then Warrior's going to come back, Jake's going to go away, and then they're both going to land up in 1996 WWF. But
It's
different things
interesting
are going on.
because they clearly didn't have a plan to put Jake and Warrior together, because they moved Jake onto Macho Man at the end of.
But the reason they did that, the reason we're going to discuss, they did that because Warrior was gone. So the plan, I think, there's an about face here. So the feud was supposed to be those two, and then ultimately, Undertaker going with Hulk Hogan. But as we'll discuss, the Ultimate Warrior, isn't going to be around post SummerSlam, which meant that they had to then move the pieces and move Jake Roberts and The Undertaker to, I would say, two other characters, not just Macho Man, because there was somebody before that, which we'll get to. But it was one of those situations of a shame because circumstances meant that the storyline didn't go anywhere. And actually, on pay-per-view, the Warrior never got his revenge. So this is going to be, sadly, the end of the storyline, but it was a great setup. And I think, the most memorable storyline when it comes to post-WrestleMania to SummerSlam 1991. There was another big debut that was going to take place. Somebody was going to come over from WCW, and his name was Sid. At this point, he was known as Sid Vicious in WCW. He was part of WCW, I think, since around 1989. Initially part of a team called the Skyscrapers with Dan Spivey, who would later on become known as Waylon Mercy for those that were watching mid-90s WWF. He then becomes part of the Four Horsemen in 1990. And I don't know, as a fan, as you are a knowledgeable fan today, do you know why he was brought into the Four Horsemen? The great reason behind him?
It was to cover against RoboCop, wasn't it?
Yep.
And that's
an episode for another day, right?
That sentence just doesn't sound right, does it? To cover against RoboCop, but that was the angle, that he was going to be the enforcer of the Four Horsemen, the Beast.
Yeah, I mean, WCW at this point, folks, was trying really hard to be WWF light, and it wasn't working. And one of the storylines was using the cross promotion of Turner Broadcasting and the film RoboCop. And RoboCop and Sting became a bit of an alliance for a little bit, and Sid was brought as the counterweight. So, not the best storyline. When it comes to around about the summer of 91, Sid's contract's coming to an end. He's seen as a huge prospect. I mean, the size, the charisma, the power, and obviously WWF are interested. WCW tried to keep him, offer him a bigger contract, promise of a world title, but he wants to go up north, as they say. And we started to see vignettes of a Sid Justice. But these vignettes were really interesting because straight away you could tell that this guy was a big deal, because they started off with, they'd show images of Sid, but it'd be other wrestlers and managers talking about him and them not really explaining if he was going to be a good guy or a bad guy here. So I remember the likes of Roddy Piper, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Jake Roberts, Mr. Perfect, and his manager at the time, the coach, various people talking about Sid and how he was their kind of guy and had this whole hype around him, which at the time was, quite unique. And you could tell, retrospectively, Vince had big plans for him. And what it leads into is they announced Sid to be the guest referee of the main event of SummerSlam 91. And that main event is going to be Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior against the Triangle of Terror. Yes, folks, we still can't get rid of Sergeant Slaughter, General Adnan, and Colonel Mustafa. So that's still going on. The reason we've not mentioned Hulk much in this period is because he was still kind of, involved in a feud with Sergeant Slaughter. But, it was a great position that they were going to debut Sid in, and you could tell there was some major plans here, because even after he's announced as the referee, everyone's hyping him and whose side is he going to be on. So I guess what are your thoughts of Sid at that time? And did you buy him as a young 6-7-year-old as this guy's going to be the next big thing here? Who is he?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, his run at WCW was quite short relative to to others in the company, and the fact that he got exposure as part of the Four Horsemen really did help. put him on TV and just give him that extra look for the viewers. But I mean, his size alone, his physique, he is a specimen of a guy, and you can tell the first time Vince McMahon laid eyes on him, he was probably wetting himself with excitement of this guy.
My next Hulk Hogan.
Yeah, and it's interesting though watching Sid. You were never really sure whether to cheer him or boo him, even when he was a good guy or a bad guy, because he was just such a monster. He would beat everybody in his path when he was in both sides, and his the way of talking, he was always like vicious and aggressive, and it really played well for his character. But yeah, when I seen him come out to do that interview segment with Mean Gene, Sergeant Slaughter and his cronies were actually quite delighted with the news. They were clapping. They were really happy having seen him last as a heel in WCW. They probably thought, oh, here comes an advantage for us. But out he comes and he tells them that he's going to make sure that justice is served one way or another. And yeah, I certainly believed he was a beast, and I thought that
then the crowd went crazy.
I thought he could legitimately beat any of the top WWF guys when he came.
Well, he was towering over all of them, as you see in that segment when he goes, he's not on their side, he's not going to join their core. The crowd goes crazy, so straight away he's positioned as a top guy. I mean, I was at this point a big Sid mark in terms of bottom as the big good guy, and the fact that he was just this kind of, he was going to destroy everyone, but ultimately he's not going to have a match until post SummerSlam. But just the way he was positioned was really good, and then he has a similar segment with Hogan and Warrior getting interviewed, and he comes out then. And he's essentially saying that he's not on their side either. So it was a really interesting dynamic. And it helped that main event, because otherwise, even though it's a handicap match, I don't think people were that interested in another kind of Slaughter and Co. versus even, if it's a dynamic duo of Warrior and Hogan. So this certainly, was a great way to increase interest. And at the time, not everyone knew who this guy was, because, we'll discuss it, but most WWF fans, mainstream fans, were not aware of what was going on in WCW. WCW tried its best to job him out before he left. I mean, his last match is a 2-minute match with El Gigante, who we'll discuss as Giant Gonzalez in the future. And, Sid is supposed to lose to him in a stretcher match, but just gets pinned and leaves. Doesn't even bother.
Supposed to go out on a stretcher at the end, but yeah, he refused, and nobody's going to mess around with Sid. So,
and it didn't impact his WWF debut, because people weren't bothered about that. The ones that knew, fine, but the majority didn't. So he was positioned as a top guy. And when people say that Vince gets accused sometimes of not promoting talent from WCW, and I think there's a lot of truth to that in the future. But when it came to certain people that were not that well known, and he felt that he could make big money from, or they were established and he felt he could make big money from that at this stage in the WWF, he was pushing them, be it the LOD, be it Sid, and another gentleman that we're going to speak about shortly. Let's address the elephant in the room. Wax, we've not spoken about one development, which actually at the time was the biggest development in modern day professional wrestling, and that was Ric Flair leaving WCW and jumping to the World Wrestling Federation. This was absolutely huge at the time, but we're not going to talk about it right now. It's such a big moment in professional wrestling that we'll discuss it in the next episode. And I know you've got a lot to say about this.
Yep, Flash, I can't wait to talk about Ric Flair. He was the greatest of his generation, in my opinion. And this little run that he has with the WWF is amongst there as one of the best runs that anybody has come into the WWF on. He's just a tremendous wrestler. He's a tremendous promo. He's just everything about him. I loved him back in the day, and I can't wait to talk about him in the next episode.
Well, this is it. Two worlds are going to collide. The NWA WCW stalwart is going to enter into Hulk Hogan's territory, but will the WWF handle it properly? And is he going to be recognized as much as he should be by the WWF audience? But that's what we're going to discuss next time, and also cover SummerSlam as well, because all of this is going to be intertwined. But I hope you're going to wear your Ric Flair robe. I hope you're going to be ready to style and profile. The real world champion is coming. The other real world champion is sitting here. But as it stands, why don't we cut this episode off, Wax? We've covered quite a lot of things, so I'll let you say our sayonara to the audience.
Yep, can't wait, Fash. Looking forward to the next episode, and I'm looking forward to taking that title off you too.